thanks Cedric for setting it up, and Will, thanks for being here today. And one of the what we're about is we just love to hear sort of a man's story and who they are and what they do. But before we get into the specifics of sort of Will's business life, his personal life, his faith journey, I guess we all probably get our paychecks from different places, but they say in Houston, we're all in the energy business. So it would be great to have you take a few minutes just from your perspective and experience and exposure and in the oil and gas world and in other forms of energy, et cetera. We just love to hear a little nugget of what you have.
Great. A good way to start out. As you said, Dom, I think all of us in this room, energy touches us in one way or another. So, and energy is an industry that's probably never been under more attack than it is today. All the time, my kids being 20 up to almost 25, I often get asked by their parents or, the kids themselves, hey, should I go into the oil and gas sector? And I tell them, look, I actually think this sector has a really bright future despite, what you hear on the news or reading the papers. And, I do for a couple reasons, and maybe I'll share that and then we can talk about all sorts of other cool stuff. But, when you look at the world of energy today, and I always start with demand, right? And you think about over the next 30 years, there's so much talk about this Paris Climate Accord. Sorry, can you guys hear me when I hold it about right here? Is that good? Okay. The Paris Climate Accord, and we've got all these CO2 reduction targets we're going to try to hit over the next 30 years so that the world doesn't get too warm. And so you got to first of all think about what's causing that, what's causing the warming, the CO2, and it's caused by people, right? People they consume things, they CO2 is emitted and other greenhouse gases are emitted, and the first thing you got to think about is over the next 30 years the world's going to add a couple billion people to the population. So that's one big thing to think about. That's more people that have ever been added in a 30-year period since the Industrial Revolution began. And secondly, those people are going to become much wealthier. You look at the amazing wealth creation in countries like China. India is not too far behind. You've got billions and billions of people that are not only being born into the world, but they're moving up the economic ladder. And as people move up the economic ladder, the one thing for sure they're going to do is they're going to consume more energy. That's one thing that enables them to move up the economic ladder. And so you're going to have this demand for energy that's going to be increasing at an increasing pace, in my opinion. And at the same time, you look at the sources of CO2, and there's a great book, if you're interested in it, that Bill Gates put out that I actually think is a pretty bipartisan book. And he talks about, what creates these greenhouse gases. And, people love to point at the oil and gas industry, but really the biggest source of CO2 equivalents is what he calls making things. So cement, steel, plastics, things that we use in our everyday lives. The second largest source, that's about a little over 30%. Power is about 27%. And then food, agriculture, farming is about 19 or 20%. Transportation is actually fourth. It's only about 17%. So, all this talk about going to electric vehicles, this and that, while it's an important part of the overall equation, it's pretty far down on the list in terms of what's going to make an impact. And then the last bucket he calls is heating things and cooling things, and that's about 7% of the total emissions. And so when you start looking at where those emissions are coming from, all of a sudden about half of those emissions have nothing to do with energy. Okay, so we gotta address that as a world. But then coming back to energy, people love to talk about this transition. We're going to transition to this clean energy future. And energy transitions are nothing new. We've had energy transitions going on since the Industrial Revolution started in the early 1800s. The first energy transition was into coal, right? That was that's really what made the Industrial Revolution possible. It took 50 years for coal to reach about 35% market share. Then in the early 1900s, oil came in with the invention of the automobile. And over the next 50 years, oil reached a market penetration of a little north of 25%. And then in the late 30s, natural gas started being used. And over time, that reached a market penetration of about 20%. And then nuclear a few decades later, and that peaked out at about 6 or 7%. So we're really in the fifth energy transition today in wind and solar. And what's interesting is, even though we've had all these energy transitions in the past, we've never transitioned away from a form of energy ever. In the history of the world, we've never transitioned away from really one form of energy since the Industrial Revolution started. And we actually use more coal today, we use more oil, we use more natural gas, and we use more nuclear than we've ever used before. Their market shares may have gone down, but the absolute amount used has done nothing but gone up. And when you put that in the context of just the now we're going to try to transition all forms of energy that have ever been invented in the last 200 years out in the next 30 years, there's just no way, right? And so even when you look at the most liberal think tanks or the most aggressive estimates, reports about what is the penetration of renewables over the next 20 to 30 years, by 2040, you get to something like the most aggressive would be 25% penetration of renewables. So for everybody in this room, if you're in the oil and gas business or some way related to it, I think that's really good news for us. Certainly we invest in oil and gas. That's where we got our start, but we also invest in renewables and batteries and charging stations and everything energy transitions. And so we take a very agnostic view. We're just in business to make a profit for our investors in an honest, high integrity way. And we think that our best investments, quite frankly, over the next decade are going to be in oil and gas related industries, not in the energy transition industries. There's actually massive amounts of capital coming into that space. Returns in a lot of these deals are negative, which means we don't want to put our money in those, and a lot of other people don't either. But clearly it's going to be, you're going to hear about it. It's going to be the talk of the world for the next 3 decades. But, just practically speaking, oil and gas, in my humble opinion, is something that we will be investing in for many, many decades, as long as we can actually get investors to give us money to invest in it, which is actually a whole nother interesting story. There's a lot of do-gooders out there, and, they think, well, you hear a lot about people divesting of fossil fuels. And if you think about it, there's really 3 aspects. There's the E part of ESG, there's the S and the G, right? People talk a lot about the E, the environment, climate change, global warming, but social issues, diversity, equity, inclusion, equal pay for equal work, all those things, forced labor, slave labor, those things, corporate governance, good corporate governance, those things are all important to people as well. And when you look at the world's going to use whatever amount of hydrocarbons and energy it's going to use, period. It really doesn't care where they're produced. But you should care where they're produced, because countries like the US, Canada, and other European nations, they actually have very high standards on the ESG, and they care about it. And they actually have the money and the resources and the technology to do something about it. If we don't produce it here in North America, if European companies don't produce it in other parts around the world, countries like China, Russia, and other Middle Eastern countries will produce that oil and gas, and they will produce it in a much less ESG friendly way. And I think that's one of the biggest arguments that we keep making to investors out there, both public and private, that don't turn your nose to this industry. If you do, you're going to make the problem worse, not better. So anyway, that's a quick 5-minute summary or 7-minute summary of views on the energy space.
That is really great. And if you were trying to take mental notes while he was going through, in about a week, this will be up on our website, so you can go back and review, okay? You can go back and siphon through it again. So that's really helpful. But Will, what I'd like to do now is, one of the things I'm always curious about is defining moments in a person's life, that string of decisions or opportunities or hardships or whatever it might be that sort of ends up landing a guy to be the man that he is and end up doing the things that he does. And so I'd love to just kind of go down that trail with you here a little bit this afternoon, just to hear some of the defining moments or the defining seasons in your life. And I'd love it if you could just start by telling us some about your upbringing, your childhood, and how you got your launch and how that might have been a part of shaping you in some ways and launching you.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a small town about 3 hours from here, Temple, Texas. And my dad was an Army guy and then went to work for the Veterans Administration Hospital. He was not a doctor. He was just kind of an administrator. So grew up kind of as a kind of lower middle income family in a small town. And growing up, you always, as you said, kind of your experience shapes who you become, and lived in a house where we didn't have a lot of money, and my parents fought about money a lot, like every night. And so, at a young age, I kind of promised to myself that, one day when I get married, two things. Number one, I'm never going to yell at my wife. And hopefully she would attest. I haven't done that. I get passionate sometimes. She says you're yelling. I was like, no, I'm just passionate. My voice gets a little higher, but I'm gonna yell. But I said that, and then I also said, no matter what, I'm gonna make a lot of money, because I'm not gonna have the same situation my parents had, because I associated their fighting with not having money. And so, as a young guy, I was the lawn mowing king of Temple, Texas. I think I had like 12 or 15 yards. I'd mow a couple every day in the summer, and always, and my dad was really big on instilling work ethic, whether it be in sports or work. Always, he'd buy me a lawnmower, and I had to pay him back for it, of course. But but he taught me a little bit about capitalism in that way.
Yeah, that's great. So you launch out of Temple, and as Cedric mentioned a moment ago, you went to TCU and you played football up there, and that's sort of the next stage of your journey.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd say I played. I went there to play. I actually got. I'm a big believer in go find who's the best at something and study that person, right? And so I was a punter. And when I was a senior in high school, the number one ranked or I guess he was first team All-American punter, was a guy named Chris Becker, punted for TCU. Actually was All-American for 2 years in a row. And so that's actually why I decided to go to TCU. I'm like, I'm going to go try to, they were talking about this guy was going to go early in the draft. And I figured, well, if he's that good, I can go learn from him. And so I did. No scholarship. They only have one scholarship for punters and one for kickers. So it was kind of like, come up here. If you earn the starting spot your sophomore year, then you get a scholarship. And so unfortunately, I got hurt my summer between my freshman and sophomore year. I cracked my back in 2 spots, so couldn't kick anymore. And, my dad was like, well, you probably ought to come on home and go to A&M or UT. And I told him I didn't really want to do that. I'd figure out a way to kind of make it on my own through college. So, that started I'd say the restart of my entrepreneurial journey. Playing football was a full-time job my freshman year, so I couldn't work. So I started a little advertising coupon book business, and then I started a Greek telephone directory business and a Greek phone board business and a window washing business. And I'd go get jobs and like bill them out at like $50 an hour, and then hire my fraternity brothers and pay them about $10 or $12 an hour and scoop the difference off the top. But I made it through college doing that. And I also, my parents always told me, again, it was very money centered, and they knew I wanted to have a successful career, make a lot of money. And so they said, well, son, be a doctor. And so my freshman year, I was a pre-med major, and no offense to any doctors in this room, but I really was not cut out to be a doctor. And so I very quickly moved to business my sophomore year, and that was kind of in line with being an entrepreneur. And so put myself through college and working about 3 or 4 different jobs.
See, I love that. That's what I love people to hear a deal like that, where I'm guessing if we had time to drill down into breaking your back and losing a dream, there's usually a sense of death in that. But you look back now and you go, in some ways, this bad thing kind of launched you into discovering the way you're wired and some sense of the calling in your life. So you finish up at TCU and you're looking for your first job. And tell us kind of how you landed in that and where you go from there, from cutting the ruts of your career.
Yeah, well, I probably my junior year, I realized I wanted to be an investment banker. I watched this movie called Wall Street, and this guy named Gordon Gekko, and man, he was like so cool, and except he wasn't. But I got really, really enamored with, the deal world, right? And so as I kind of talked to my professor, said, well, you need to go to Wall Street and you need to do investment banking. And so great, I'm going to do that. And so my senior year comes around, and, in the fall, and no investment banks came to campus to interview. And so, they must come in the spring. We had a really bad career placement center back then. I think it's a lot better today. But so spring comes around, I go up and I'm like, when are the banks coming? And they go, we don't have any investment banks that are interviewing here. I'm like, well, why not? And they're like, they don't come here. I was like, well, where do they go? And they said, well, they go to SMU. I said, okay. So I got in my car, I drove over to SMU and I pretended to be an SMU student, and I went in the career center and I said, can I have a list of all the investment banks? And they would say, well, they've already hired, they hire in the fall. I was like, oh, okay. Can I still get the list? And so I got the list and I sent out, I think, 23 letters. I got 21 letters back very quickly. Thank you for your interest, but we hired last fall. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And fortunately, 2 banks, I guess some guy decided last minute to go back to grad school at these 2 different banks. And one was NCNB, which is now, I guess, Bank of America. But so they called me up and said, hey, can you come down tomorrow? I said, yeah, I'll be there. Went down and they gave me the offer on the spot. I think I was the only guy that, they were interviewing. So I'm not sure that says a lot about why I got the job, but sometimes it's good to be the only guy. And so anyway, yeah, and that's why I started at NCNB in 1992 here in Houston.
No, that's great. Well, so we had an opportunity to talk before, and I loved hearing all the different sort of pathways. So you start out with them, and then you move on, and you end up with a job assignment that really ended up being the gateway to you for the next stage of your life and career. Yeah.
So, and actually I saw Dennis Combrink here earlier with Priority Associates. I know Cedric mentioned him because that's literally part of where my faith journey started in Houston. But a guy that I met through that, Dennis, you'll remember, hopefully, Chris Manning. He was at a really good investment bank here in town at the time called Kidder Peabody. And, it's the power of networking. And so I very quickly realized that NCNB I was not going to get good experience, but I networked my way over to Kidder and got over there. And my first year there, my boss asked me to look at this thing called private equity. And she was just curious about it. We did public debt and equity offerings and M&A. And so she said, go out and just do a little research for me and come back and educate me on it. So I did. And there was like 6 groups in the U.S. that did energy private equity. And went out and met with them and came back and told her a little bit about them. And then I turned in my resignation. And she's like, what are you doing? And I said, well, they finance people to start oil and gas companies, and I'm going to go start an oil and gas company. And she's like, you're 22 or 23 years old, whatever it was at the time. She goes, what are you talking about? I'm just going to go start an oil and gas company. So what I didn't realize is that Chevron and Exxon had no interest in selling Gulf of Mexico platforms to a 23-year-old kid. There was a guy, most of y'all probably know Jim Flores here in town. He'd started a company called Flores and Rucks, and he had gotten this 100% volumetric production payment financing. And I'm like, well, if he can do it, I can too. Except I couldn't. And I after I basically was told no about 20 times by different oil and gas companies, I very quickly retreated and said, okay, I'm never going to raise money to start my oil and gas company at this ripe age at 23. But, I'm an investment banking expert because I spent a couple years in investment banking and I know how to model. Those of you in here that went to investment banking know that's true. 100 hours a week for 2 years, you know how to model and you know how to put together pitch books and write prospectuses and put together nice presentations. And so I said, I'm not going to have my own oil and gas company, but I bet I can go help other people get their oil and gas companies. And so, one of the big lessons, takeaways is something I've always used in my life is, fail quick. Don't be prideful. When you make a mistake, just own it and learn from it and move on. And that's what I did. And that was actually the start of Windrock Capital, which some of you guys in this room may be familiar with, but started an advisory business basically to help oil and gas entrepreneurs raise private capital. And so I did that for about 5 years. And it was really good. Another big learning in life is that timing matters, right? Bill Gates and Michael Dell and a handful of these other great tech entrepreneurs happened to be born at the right time and entered the industry at the right time. And even though I was coming into the oil and gas industry at a time where it was on its back, that was really the right time. And it was because the entrepreneurs that were left in the business by the mid-90s when I started my investment banking firm were really good. They'd survived. They were the 10% that stayed in business from the early 80s. And so I had this opportunity to, I was either going to go, because this is all happening by the time I met my wife. Am I going to go back to grad school? Am I not? And, I got my MBA basically through living in towns like Midland and Tulsa and Denver, Dallas, basically doing diligence to put together private offering memorandums to go raise money for these companies. And I got to learn from these amazing entrepreneurs, right? And they would take me under their wing. They'd teach me about their business. I'd ask lots of questions. That's another one of those life lessons is ask lots of questions, right? Find people that are really smart at what they do and learn from them and be intellectually curious. And I was. And they rewarded that by just kind of telling me, here's how I make money. Here's how I manage my business. And so at a very young age, I started to kind of piece together, these are the ingredients of what makes a successful energy entrepreneur. And then I was working with 6 different groups across the country. Most were here in Houston and Dallas. There's a couple in New York. But the groups like NCAP and NGP and Yorktown and First Reserve, great firms, really good at what they did, all very different in different ways and similar in some ways. And, I kind of just learned from them, like, how do you do this? Why do you do this? Why do you not do that? And learned how they did deals, learned how they underwrote deals. And when I was about 27, I decided I'd done enough of that. And those of you that are in the private equity or, money management business know that there's this concept of 2 and 20. You get a 2% management fee and a 20% piece of the profits. And I was like, earning a 4 or 5% success fee is not near as good as 2 and 20. And so I need to move over to that other side and become, and I'd always wanted to own my own, I own my own business, but I always wanted to kind of operate a business too, right? I wanted to be an oil and gas operator. Wasn't going to do that. Next best thing is I'm going to invest in great oil and gas operators. So met a guy that was in his 60s and had a partner that I'd started Windrock with, and we convinced this guy that we actually knew what we were talking about, a couple 27-year-old kids about starting a private equity firm, and he bought off on it. And the rest is history. We started Quantum in 1998.
Wow. Well, that's great. Well, its path forward from there is definitely reputable, and we know about it. So can you just kind of give us a glimpse into how that kind of all unfolds and, how you built the company and the culture and the impact of Quantum?
So, I think big on culture. Culture is who you are. It's what you stand for. And as a founder, as a CEO, you are the culture carrier of your firm, right? So when we think about the culture of our firm, it was always about, it was very biblically based and basically that we treat other people like we want to be treated, right? You always do the right thing the right way. You don't take shortcuts. You work hard. You work really hard. And I think when I look back over the last 23, 24 years, those things have carried us a long way. And when it comes to investing in my mind is really simple. It's you find really good people that have some competitive advantage, and you figure out how to align yourselves with those people, right? When they win, you win, you lose, they lose, so that you've got good alignment. And you got to be very disciplined, right? You got to be very unemotional. I think the biggest mistake most investors make is they get emotional, and you got to be consistent. And there's going to be a lot of times whenever you're going to be tempted to not be consistent because, like in our business, how many people do you guys know that don't think commodity prices are going to be higher next year than they are today, right? And then higher the next year than they are next year, right? Or, hey, I can raise more debt, and if I do that, I'll own more of the equity. But guess what? That means you're also taking more risk, right? And if prices go down and you have too much debt, you can go out of business. And so, we just had some very basic principles of it's all about people, great great entrepreneurs, great managers can make okay assets really good. Mediocre or below average managers can screw up really good assets. So it always starts with the people for us first. And then we always just stayed really disciplined. We didn't leverage up a lot. We hedged like crazy. We didn't believe commodity prices were always going to be higher. We knew that we were in a volatile commodity industry. And we just said, we're going to work harder. We're going to be a value-added partner to our partners. And if we do that, we'll build a brand that will be an enduring brand. It will cause people to want to come do business with us because we actually deliver something more than just capital. And that's, I think, been one of the big hallmarks of our success is we have been able to do that. And we did that a lot by taking a very unconventional approach to the business, right? Most of the people in our space were financial engineers. And while I guess kind of think I'm a financial engineer, I spent 2 years on Wall Street. I also know that that it's really technical and operating people that help us understand the risk and then manage the risk. And as an investor, that's really what investing is all about, is identifying what the risks really are, being honest about them, and evaluating those, and then understanding how to manage those risks. All the time that you're in that investment, you're always managing risk, and you got to be able to price risk accordingly. And I think a lot of people mess up because they misprice risk. And so I think those are the things as a firm culturally that we've tried to really perfect, and if you will, over the last kind of almost quarter century, is doing that. And to do that, we had to have a lot of technical operating and scientists and technology people. And that's where we really poured huge dollars in our firm to find the best people to do that.
That's great. Well, it's turned out well. It's beautiful. So one thing you mentioned about your culture, you mentioned it's kind of founded on biblical values, and there's no secret. You're very sort of publicly open about the fact that you're a follower of Christ, and He is an essential part of your life. So what I really love to do now is think back, and not just in the defining moments of your personal business life, but really some of the defining moments in your faith journey that have really been a part of defining that part of your life. For instance, you mentioned Priority Associates just a moment ago, and when we were talking, you said that's where your spiritual journey really began. And tell us a little bit about that and what that means and how it's directed you.
Yeah, I grew up in a home, went to church for a while, and then my parents quit going to church. And then in high school, I got involved in the youth group just because it was cool to do. Went to Young Life, but I don't think very much of it. There's a couple of you guys in the room that knew me in high school, and you definitely say it didn't stick very well. So, but went to college, and was really didn't spend really any time in the Word or going to church, and really wasn't until I got out of college and I started my first job. The guy that I was working for, he invited me to this Priority Associates luncheon. I think at the time it was called like Here's Life Houston or something like that, but predecessor to PA. And he also invited me to go to church with him. And I hadn't been to church probably in, 3 or 4 years. So, but I did. I went, and God very quickly, just kind of pricked my heart. And I say there's about a year that went on there where I was kind of had one foot in both worlds, and go out and do crazy things on Friday and Saturday night, and then Sunday morning repent and like, oh, what did I do that for? And honestly, it was just a really kind of very period in my life where God really broke me, just really brought me to a point of realizing that a life apart from Him was not a life worth living. And I remember clearly the church I'd gotten involved in, and PA was really a big part of that faith journey for me in my kind of early walk. And plus, I met this amazing Christian lady who probably didn't know how young of a Christian I was, but she was an amazing influence, and very quickly made sure I was straightened out. So
that's awesome.
And those of you know what I'm talking about.
Well, one of the defining moments on the faith journey side of things. So you're a fairly young guy, and you're doing well financially. It's coming in fast, and which is a little bit of a could be a very bad formula for a guy's life, right? And in the middle of that, you get exposed to the world of generous giving, and it begins to reframe your perspective on money and value in a way that's consistent with your faith, right? And so tell us, the kind of the way that shaped you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, when I was in my mid-20s, I mean, the investment bank that we'd started, I mean, it was really cranking. And, I was 25, 26, making $2 or $3 million a year. That was a lot of money. I mean, I, again, grew up with nothing. So that was like all the money in the world. And it's really cool when you look back in your life and you kind of see how God, at every turn, just how God kind of, guided you here, guided you there. But some friends invited us to a generous giving conference up in Colorado Springs when I was either 25 or 26. So, and I heard two things there that were just life transforming. One was everything I own belongs to God. None of it belongs to me. And I had nothing to do with anything that I had. And I disagreed with that. And that was tough, right? And so I started wrestling with that, and I looked at what the Bible had to say, and fortunately I had a lot of good speakers that just kept hammering that into us that weekend. And by the end of the weekend, my wife and I are sitting down. I'm like, oh my gosh, like none of this that I've done is result of what I've done, right? I think as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, we look at, oh yeah, I worked so hard, I went to this school, did that job, did this, I'm so smart. And the truth is that God gives us the mind to be able to do those things. He gives us the energy to be able to get up early and work late. He gives us the relationships. He opens the doors that, we would not have gotten opened on our own. And all of a sudden you look back and realize, I didn't really do any of that. And that was really important realization for me, because for two reasons. One, it was incredibly freeing, right? Knowing that I'm not in control. Because as a business guy, I want to be in control. I was a control freak. Many of my teammates today probably still think I'm a control freak, but I realize it's like, in baseball, they say, don't hold that bat too tight, because if you do, you're not going to be able to hit the ball well. And I think we tend in business or entrepreneurs, we hold on to what we have too tight, and realizing that I wasn't responsible for this, and I was just a steward, right? Not only was I not responsible for it, but I had something that God had given me, and there was a very high responsibility that went with that. Then the Bible says we are stewards of God's resources, right? And as a steward, there's a very high calling. You have a fiduciary obligation to take care of those resources. Those are God's resources, right? So it started us on this journey of generosity and giving, of like, okay, God's blessing us. What are we going to do with that blessing? And then I said there was two big takeaways. The other big takeaway was, then this guy gets up at the end, after they convince us that, okay, we're not responsible, everything belongs to God, we're a steward. Now, this guy gets up and he challenges us to be a reverse tither. I'm like, what is a reverse tither? And reverse tithing is you keep 10 and give away 90. Like, who would do that? Right? But they had some people up there that did do that. They weren't just saying it, they were living it out with their life. And boy, that was another one of those just aha moments. My wife and I sat down like, okay, like, we're not there today. And he even said, you don't have to be here today, but over your life, you want to get here. And, a lot of you guys in this room know guys like David Weekley and Terry Looper. And, those have been some real mentors of mine over the last 15 or so years. And David's been a guy that's just hammered that into me. And, he gives away half his time, half his money every year. He's still not to the reverse tithing yet. I keep reminding him of that, but we're going to get him there. But anyway, so those were pretty transformational things for me at a young age. And I just thank the Lord that, I'd be a wreck. I mean, I've seen so many people that have had a lot of success, especially young. And if they don't get that, it destroys them. I've seen so many, even some of my former partners that, have just been destroyed by a lot of wealth and success. So
I love those two tracks, the sense of rest on the one side and the sense of stewardship on the other. It's great. I'm guessing if you're anything like the rest of us, you have to keep recovering into those places from time to time. Yeah. So you talked about some of the guys who influenced you in your life, Terry Looper and David Weekley, and then one of the other guys you mentioned to me was Steve Menifee, who became a discipler to you, right? And And you said that that was one of the very important things, is someone who could kind of look into your eye. Yeah, I think you said look into your soul, something like that, right? Tell me about the importance of another man in your life like that.
Yeah, so I don't know, probably 15 years ago, I was invited to join an organization called the CEO Forum, and it's kind of like a YPO for Christian CEOs. It's a national organization, a couple hundred members. A few of you guys in this room are members of that as well. And they've got this class called the Spiritual Leadership Institute. It's a 3-year class. You meet for 2 days, once a quarter for 3 years. A guy named Henry Blackaby, who, again, some of y'all may know that name. He's a very prolific, written a lot of great Bible studies and books and this and that. Basically built the class in conjunction with the CEO Forum and taught it, he and his son. And then another guy, named Steve Menifee, that you mentioned, he was the other kind of facilitator. And as part of the class, it was all about becoming a spiritual statesman, and that meant a lot of different things. But you got a person that was going to come alongside you and disciple you for the next 3 years. And I'd never been discipled, and I kind of thought, oh, well, this is just like a mentor. And he very quickly explained to me that he's not a mentor; he's a discipler, and there's a big difference. In a mentor relationship, you're free as the mentee to take the advice or not take the advice, and thank you very much. In a discipleship relationship, it's very much like Jesus and his disciples, is you're putting yourself under the authority of that discipler, and it's a very different relationship, and you are committing that you're going to not only take their advice, but you're gonna put it to work in your life, and you're gonna have a very transparent relationship with them. And I never, there's a lot of good ministries that focus on men's discipleship, and until I went through that, I never got it. I never got how important it was for men to come alongside other men and disciple them. Like, we need that so bad, so desperately. And but yeah, that was a Steve. He peered into me, and he's just like, Will, you're a Christian, you're saved, but you've got what I call cheap grace. I'm like, what is cheap grace? He's like, you've made Jesus your Lord. I mean, you've made Jesus your Savior, but he's not your Lord, right? He's not really your Lord. And I'm like, okay, explain. He's like, well, you're saved. Like, you acknowledge that Christ was God's son. He came to the earth, died on a cross, rose from the grave, saved you from your sins, given your life to him and all that stuff, but you really haven't completely submitted to him, right? The Bible says Jesus says, if you love me, you obey my commands. And I was really had to take a hard look at my life. I'm like, well, yeah, I obey a lot of your commands. I haven't totally sold out, right? And that was for me. Another one was just transformational, like just a Christian man come alongside me that'd been a CEO, successful CEO, and he just called me out on it. And I was like, you're right. And so.
That's incredible. So what you said that part of the discussion of that was the idea of being a spiritual statesman. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, a spiritual statesman is basically truly living out a life where you've truly surrendered, and Christ is your Lord, not just your Savior. And so what that means is you're an ambassador effectively for Christ wherever you are, whether that's your family, whether that's in your social setting, social groups, whether that's in your church, whether that's in your business, but that you are always representing Jesus Christ. Wow. And you're a witness that it's our actions speak much louder than our words. Yeah. And so it's living out a Christ-filled life every day.
Wow. That's a great description. Good. So when you and I had a chance to talk, you said two things that blew me away. One that you've kind of already talked on, but you said, two things. One is one of the things you're most excited about was giving away a ton of money. That was one of the things. And then the second thing you said that kind of blew me away is that you get nervous when things are going well and that you look forward to trials. Okay. Those are both fairly radical perspectives on life. You want to say anything about those? Maybe you've already in the giving a little bit, but especially trials.
Yeah, I think the giving's pretty straightforward. I mean, the Bible. I think there's more verses in the Bible about money than like any other topic, or it's either one or two. So there's so many great verses that come to mind there. But I do think about like King Solomon in the Old Testament and in Ecclesiastes. Where he basically says, he who loves money will never have enough, right? And he also says you're not going to take anything with you. And so, okay, so you don't want to love money, and you're not going to take it with you. and like in the book of Matthew, where it talks about in Matthew 6, don't store up for yourself treasure on this earth where rust and moth can destroy and thieves can break in and steal, but store it up in heaven. And also like Matthew 6, where it talks about you can't serve two masters. You'll love one, hate the other. You can't serve both God and mammon, and many other. But all those things kind of point to, again, you're a steward. Point to God blesses you. I've come to believe in my life that God blesses our family so we can bless others. And if we're not faithful to that, God does not want me to have money for the sake of me having money. God wants me to have money for the sake that we can help lots of other people. And there's so much more joy, quite frankly. The saying that's more joyful to give than is to receive. And it's just so true. I mean, it's an amazing way also to pull your family together. We've involved our kids in all of our giving and done so many things together and tried to really instill a heart of generosity in them from a very young age too. But so anyway, that's on giving. I think on some of y'all may have read the book, the Andy Grove book, Only the Paranoid Survive. And that's kind of not really very biblical, but because we shouldn't be paranoid. But I do look at trials. When I look back in my life, I grew the most both in business and spiritually when I faced hardships. And one thing I know is it never stays good forever. So the longer you're going through a lull, a period of where everything's kind of okay, the more paranoid I start getting that something's about not to be okay, right? And so, but most importantly is I know that's where I've grown. Like God has used trials and tribulations to always bring me closer to Him and to always teach me lessons that I wouldn't otherwise learn. And I know that's why when it's like everything's going great, I get really nervous. Like, what is God about to teach me now, right? It's coming. So that's why I said what I said there.
Well, that's great. I think it's great coaching for all of us right now, because if we might be in that spot right now where, we're in the deep weeds of some kind and the difficulty just really you may just take that moment and just say, okay, not just can I get through this, but what can I get out of this right in the middle of it? That's great. So finally, and then we'll have to wrap up, but so, we're glad to have you at Toolbox. The tagline for Toolbox is helping men go beyond success into significance. All right, just love to get your take on that, how that resonates with you, what that engenders in you as you hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's a great tagline. Success is meaningless without significance. I think many people probably confuse the two. And I think significance is a much more profound concept, because significance, in my mind, has more of an eternal perspective, right? You can have success without having significance. You can't have significance without having success in whatever it is that you're doing, is from my perspective. So, and so I just think significance is, it's making a difference in people's lives, and it is living your life so that at the end of your life, God will say, well done, good and faithful servant.
I love that. Well, that's a great place for us to wrap it up here for today. And so would you guys just join me in giving great thanks to Wil? Thank you, man. Yeah, thank you so much.